Teachers come out every night, try to tell you what's wrong and what's right. But when asked about something to eat, they will answer with voices so sweet. You will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray, live on hay, you'll get pie in the sky when you die.
Joel Emanuel Hoglund was born in 1879 in Galve in Gästrikland, Sweden. In October of 1902, he and his brother Paul immigrated to the United States. Joel quickly became a moving worker, traveling wherever the jobs took him, generally westward. The finer details of his travels in his life at this point are uncertain, but we do know that he was in San Francisco at the time of the 1906 earthquake, and that he joined the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, one big union, sometime in 1910 when he was in San Pedro, California. Late that year, we know he was in Portland, Oregon, according to a letter he wrote to the IWW newspaper. As he traveled across the country from job to job, he wrote songs and poems as he made speeches to workers or members of the IWW. This is also where he picked up the pseudonym Joe Hill. As is common with folk music, many of the melodies for his songs came from other songs or hymns that were popular at the time. The phrase "pie in the sky" is attributed to him, alongside the writing credits for a number of famous Union songs. Some of the songs he wrote include "The Preacher and the Slave," "The Tramp."
Tramp, 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 keep on a-trampin'. There's nothing doing here for you. If I catch you round again, you will wear the ball and chain. So just keep on trampin', the best thing you can do.
There is power in a union.
There is power in a band of working folk when we stand hand in hand. That's the power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand. Have you got that again?
The Rebel Girl, not the Confederate kind, and Casey Jones, the Union Scab. By the end of 1913, Joe Hill would find himself working at the Silver King mine in Utah, not too far from Salt Lake City. On January 10th, 1914, John G. Morrison and his son were both killed in a grocery store by two armed intruders, masked in red bandanas. At first, police thought it was a crime of revenge, given that nothing had been stolen and John Morrison had been a police officer. Later that same day, Joe Hill appeared at a local doctor with a bullet wound through his left lung. He said he had been shot in an argument over a woman, who he refused to name. The doctor reported that Hill was armed with a pistol. Considering Morrison's past as a police officer, several men he had arrested were at first considered suspects. A red bandana was found in Hill's room. Hill denied that he was involved in the robbery and the killing. He said that when he was shot, his hands were over his head, and the bullet hole in his coat, 4 inches below the exit wound, seemed to support this claim. Hill did not testify at his trial, but his lawyers pointed out that 4 other people were treated for bullet wounds in Salt Lake City that same night, and the lack of robbery and Hill's unfamiliarity with Morrison left him with no real motive. That didn't necessarily matter. The prosecution, for its part, produced a dozen witnesses who said that the killer resembled Hill, including the 13-year-old Merlin Morrison, who was one of John's sons, who, upon first seeing Hill, said, quote, "That's not him at all," end quote, but then later identified him as the murderer. The jury took just a few hours to find him guilty. Appeals proved unsuccessful. Hill's lawyer declared, quote, "The main thing the state had on Hill was that he was a wobbly, and therefore sure to be guilty. Hill tried to keep the IWW out of the trial, but the press fastened it upon him." In an article for the socialist newspaper Appeal to Reason, Hill wrote, quote, "Owing to the prominence of Mr. Morrison, there had to be a goat, and the undersigned being, as they thought, a friendless tramp, a Swede, and worst of all, an IWW, had no right to live anyway. and was therefore duly selected to be the GOAT. End quote. The case turned into a major media event. Everyone from President Woodrow Wilson, Helen Keller, the blind and deaf author and fellow IWW member, and even the Swedish ambassador all became involved in a bid for clemency. Clemency would not come to Joe Hill, however. On November 19th, 1915, Joe Hill was executed by firing squad at the Sugar House prison. It's now a park and a high school. Before his execution, Hill wrote to Big Bill Haywood, a founding member of the IWW and a union leader, quote, "Goodbye, Bill. I die like a true blue rebel. Don't waste any time in mourning. Organize. Could you arrange to have my body hauled to the state line to be buried? I don't want to be found dead in Utah." The phrase, "Don't mourn, organize," would become a rallying cry of left-wing movements in the United States and globally, especially following the deaths of major leaders or failures. Joe Hill's will itself would also later be set to song.
My will is easy to decide, for there is nothing to divide. My kin don't need to fuss and moan, moss does not cling to a rolling stone. My body? Ah, if I could choose, I would to ashes it reduce, and let some merry breezes blow them to where some flowers grow. Perhaps some fading flower then would take root and bloom again. This is my last and final will. Good luck to all of you. Joe Hill.
In the end, Joe Hill's death did exactly what he imagined it would do. In fact, some believe that the reason he didn't go for an appeal was that he knew, should he die, he would become a martyr for the IWW. And sure enough, he did become a martyr for the labor movement across the country, a very deliberate point on a map for the IWW and other unions to say, this is what we're up against, this is what they'll try to do for us. And it would work. IWW membership would continue to rise over the following years. They would claim some 100,000 members at its peak in 1923. Ultimately, the 1920s were defined by several things, but perhaps most crucially, a bubble. And that bubble it would not grow forever. And when it popped, it would spell catastrophe for a lot of people in a very short amount of time.
I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died.